And what happens when someone who was elevated to represent the very best of a nation turns around and chants for something that looks, sounds, and feels an awful lot like a call for violence? Here is the situation. Grace Tame, who was named Australian of the Year in 2021 for her work advocating for survivors of sexual abuse, stood in front of thousands of people at Sydney's Town Hall and led a chant. The words were, "From Gadigal to Gaza, globalise the Intifada." She did not whisper it, she did not mumble it in passing, she shouted it into a microphone, and then she re-shared the footage on her own social media, proudly. This happened on the same day that Israeli President Isaac Herzog was visiting Sydney, and while thousands of Jewish Australians were gathered elsewhere in the city mourning the victims of the Bondi Beach terror attack, an attack that killed 15 people just 6 weeks earlier. 15 people were murdered because of who they were. Now, some might say, well, she is entitled to protest. She is entitled to her views. And that is true. Nobody is arguing against the right to protest. But rights come with responsibilities, and words carry weight, especially when those words have a very specific historical meaning that cannot simply be wished away by good intentions or political convenience. Let us be very clear about what globalize the Intifada actually means. The word Intifada refers to a specific series of violent uprisings against Israel. The Second Intifada, in particular, was characterized by suicide bombings targeting civilian areas, buses, cafes, shopping centers, ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, torn apart by deliberate acts of terror. When someone chants "globalize the Intifada," they are not calling for peaceful dialogue. They are not calling for a negotiated two-state solution. They are calling for the expansion of that kind of violence across the world. That is not an interpretation. That is what the words mean. And to chant those words on a day when Jewish Australians were mourning a hate crime is something that goes beyond political expression and enters the territory of something far more troubling. And here is where the irony becomes almost unbearable. Grace Tame's public profile built on a deeply important cause. She spoke powerfully about the trauma of sexual assault, about the way survivors are silenced, about the systems that protect perpetrators. That work mattered. It resonated with millions of people. But the events of October the 7th, 2023, which is what an intifada looks like in practice, included mass sexual violence as a deliberate weapon of terror. Women were brutalized in ways that are almost impossible to describe. The very crime that Grace Tame spent years fighting against was weaponized on that day by the very movement she now appears to be championing. The contradiction is staggering. It is not a minor inconsistency. It is a complete inversion of everything she claimed to stand for. And what about Matilda, a young girl shot in the head because she was Jewish? Where is the outrage for her? Where is the advocacy for that child? It seems that for some people, victimhood is only worthy of attention when it fits a particular political narrative. When the victims are Jewish, when the perpetrators align with fashionable causes, the silence is deafening. And that selective empathy is not compassion. It is ideology dressed up as morality. There is a pattern here that is worth paying attention to. Grace Tame's trajectory since receiving the Australian of the Year award has been, to put it diplomatically, a steady drift away from the unifying purpose of that honour and toward increasingly partisan and divisive activism. The award is meant to recognise someone who brings Australians together, who represents something admirable about the national character. Robert Gregory, the president of the Australian Jewish Association, put it plainly when he said, "The role of Australian of the Year is to unite the nation, not to make minority communities feel for their lives." That is not a controversial statement. That is the basic expectation. And yet, here we are, with a former Australian of the Year leading a chant that Jewish Australians, quite rightly, interpret as a direct threat to their safety. Not a hypothetical threat, not an exaggerated reaction, a direct threat, grounded in the very real history of what intifadas have actually involved. Before I go further, if you're finding this analysis valuable, if you think this kind of honest conversation matters, I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. These topics are not always easy to talk about, but they are important, and the more people who engage with them, the better the conversation becomes. So thank you for being here, genuinely. Now, some defenders of Grace Tame will argue that she is simply standing up for Palestinian rights, that she is protesting against civilian suffering in Gaza, and that her intentions are humanitarian. And look, if that were truly the case, there are 1,000 ways to advocate for Palestinian civilians without calling for a globalization of a violent uprising. You can call for a ceasefire, you can call for humanitarian aid, you can call for a two-state solution. Even Tanya Plibersek, a Labour minister, acknowledged that the phrase "globalize the Intifada" is fundamentally incompatible with a peaceful resolution because it implies a single state, which means the elimination of the other. That is not peace, that is conquest by another name. The question that keeps coming back is whether Grace Tame genuinely understands what she is endorsing, or whether she has simply been absorbed into a movement that uses the language of justice to advance something far darker. And honestly, at a certain point, the distinction stops mattering. Whether you chant those words out of genuine ideological commitment or out of a desire to remain relevant and applauded by a particular crowd, the effect is the same. Jewish families in Australia hear those words and feel afraid. Children hear those words and wonder if they are safe. That is the real-world consequence of what happened at Town Hall that day. Pauline Hanson called for the National Australia Day Council to revoke the award, saying Grace Tame had brought both the honour and the nation into disrepute. And while people may have complicated feelings about Pauline Hanson herself, the substance of that request is hard to argue against. If the Australian of the Year award means anything at all, if it carries genuine weight as a symbol of national pride and contribution, then it has to be possible to withdraw it when the recipient acts in a way that fundamentally contradicts its purpose. Otherwise, the award is meaningless. It becomes nothing more than a trophy that can be used as a platform for any cause, no matter how divisive or dangerous. There is something deeper going on here that deserves attention, and it has to do with the way certain public figures evolve once they receive a platform. Grace Tame was elevated because of genuine personal courage. No one can take that away from her original story. But what has happened since is a case study in how platforms can be captured by ideological movements that have very little to do with the original cause. Shadow Employment Minister Tim Wilson made an important point when he said that if you side with the agenda behind Globalise the Intifada, you are effectively saying you want the genocide of the Jewish people, the subjugation of women, and the murder of homosexuals by government decree. That is not hyperbole. Those are the documented, observable realities of the regimes and movements that the Intifada chant aligns with. And the fact that a former champion of women's rights is now amplifying that message is something that should disturb anyone who cares about intellectual consistency. It is also worth thinking about the broader protest environment in Sydney that day. Around 7,000 Jewish Australians were gathered in the city to mourn, to grieve, to process what had happened at Bondi Beach, and simultaneously, thousands of protesters were attempting to breach police lines, clashing with officers, creating an atmosphere of intimidation and chaos. NSW Premier Chris Minns defended the police response, noting that the situation could not be judged on a 10-second clip and that repeated attempts were made to break through security cordons. If those lines had been breached, if the protesters had reached the mourners, the consequences could have been catastrophic. That is not speculation. That is a reasonable assessment based on the mood, the chants, and the aggression that was on full display. Kevin Hogan, the Nationals' deputy leader, raised another crucial point that often gets overlooked in these debates. He said that when people chant slogans like "Globalise the Intifada," Islamic extremists within the country watch and listen. They feel validated. They interpret those chants as permission, as social endorsement of the violence they already want to commit. This is not about policing thoughts or silencing dissent. This is about understanding the real-world chain of consequences that inflammatory language can trigger. Words are not just words when they echo through communities that include radicalized individuals looking for justification. And this brings us to the question of enforcement. Australia has been debating hate speech laws for years, and Queensland Premier David Crisafulli recently strengthened his state's legislation specifically to address anti-Semitic hate speech. Julian Leeser, the Shadow Arts Minister, encouraged every state and territory leader to follow that example. The argument is straightforward. If Globalize the Intifada is understood by both its advocates and its targets as a call for violent uprising against Jewish people, then it meets any reasonable definition of incitement. The fact that it is chanted at public rallies, amplified on social media, and led by a former Australian of the Year does not make it more acceptable. It makes it more dangerous. There is a comparison that has been made, and while no analogy is perfect, it carries some weight. Grace Tame has been compared to Greta Thunberg, not in terms of their causes, but in terms of the trajectory. Both were elevated to global or national prominence at a young age. Both were celebrated for a specific sympathetic cause, and both have since drifted into broader political activism that has alienated significant portions of the public and raised serious questions about whether their platforms are being used responsibly. The concern is not that young people should not have opinions. The concern is what happens when a powerful platform, granted on the basis of one issue, becomes a megaphone for causes that are fundamentally different and far more contentious. Some commentators have suggested that Grace Tame has become, in effect, a tool for the Greens and certain elements of the Labour movement. Whether or not that characterization is entirely fair, it captures something real about the way activist ecosystems work. Once someone becomes a symbol, they are valuable not just for what they originally stood for, but for the legitimacy they can lend to other causes. And the people who manage those ecosystems are very skilled at directing that symbolic power towards their preferred outcomes. It's worth asking whether Grace Tame is driving her own agenda or whether she is being driven by one. What should not be lost in all of this is the human cost. Real families, real communities, real people are affected when public figures normalize language that calls for their destruction. The Jewish community in Australia has been through an incredibly difficult period. The Bondi attack was not abstract. It was not distant. It happened on a beach that families visit every weekend. And to have a former Australian of the Year stand up within weeks of that tragedy and chant for the globalization of a movement defined by the targeting of civilians, that is something that goes beyond politics. It's a moral failure. The question of whether the award should be revoked is ultimately symbolic, but symbols matter. They signal what a society considers acceptable and what it does not. If the award stands without any formal response, the message is that the title of Australian of the Year can be used to promote violent rhetoric without consequences. And if that's the message, then the award itself becomes worthless. It becomes another hollow gesture in a culture that is increasingly full of them. At the end of the day, this is not about silencing anyone. It's about accountability. Grace Tame has every right to hold whatever views she chooses, but the rest of society also has the right to say clearly and firmly that those views are incompatible with the honour she was given, and more importantly, that the safety and dignity of Jewish Australians, and indeed of all Australians, is not negotiable. Not for a chant, not for a protest, not for anyone's 15 minutes of relevance. That's where things stand, and it's worth watching closely what happens next, because the response to this moment will say a great deal about what kind of society Australia intends to be.